Okay, Adab. Uh, it is always a privilege to speak at T2F, one of the very few fora and spaces in this city that is committed to independent thought and activity. This city that is no doubt one of the most intellectually devastated modern urban spaces in the world, even compared to other smaller Pakistani cities, especially given the fact that it is, of course, one of the biggest cities in the world, something that can be gleaned from the fact that there is not one decent bookstore to be found in a city of some 20 million people. Of course, that said, I cannot help but remember, especially since it was the anniversary of her passing just yesterday, when she was so cruelly taken from us 6 years ago, so young and with so much to give. I cannot help but remember that the other times I was privileged to speak at T2F was, in fact, in the life of our deeply, widely mourned sister, Sabine Mahmood, who is, of course, largely responsible for what T2F is and represents in Karachi. I'm thankful to Shumaila Amjad for inviting me to chair this distinguished panel on the definitive event of our regional modernity, legacy of violence, shaping the now, tales of partition. The partition is a deep wound, one that does not heal, but grows deeper with time, even as it recedes from immediate visibility, but festers and does its fatal work inside our social, cultural, and political bodies. Even as it is singular, however, partition is by no means unique to our region. Over 50% of the borders that exist and constitute our world and worlds today came into existence in the 20th century. Another nearly 40% are a legacy of the 19th century, and the rest came into existence in the early modern period that stretches from the 17th through the 18th centuries. Given that Homo sapiens, that is, human beings, are roughly 200,000 years old, that represents 0.2% of history, counting from the much celebrated Gora Treaty of Westphalia, or if we count most of the borders, that is from the 19th and 20th centuries, 0.1% of human history. Just a little more than the blink of an eye, or maybe a brief nap, a power nap, one might say. And yet today, national borders seem the most natural states of affairs in the world, at least or especially to the literate classes of the world, whose literacy is virtually synonymous with nationality, thanks to the massive apparatuses of the nation states of the world created simultaneously with these manifestly unnatural modern borders. Created, one must immediately say, with unprecedented violence, first in Europe, where the Treaty of Westphalia came into existence precisely to contain the unprecedented civil and proto-national wars across early modern Europe, and subsequently across the world, where they came into existence thanks to the radical transformation of cultures, societies, languages, concepts, polities by another unprecedented modern institution, that of the brutal, modern, apartheid colonial state, which, of course, I must immediately mention, this is also the month in which we commemorate the memory of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919. For unlike the empires of the past, the modern European empires were national empires, and by the same token, racial and apartheid empires. And apartheid is apartheid all the way down. It does not just distinguish between Goras and Kalas, a distinction that it literally writes into all of human history through the racist modern doctrine of progress. It also creates permanent and implacable distinctions between the Kalas, say between Muslim Kalas and Hindu Kalas. The phenomenal violence, the continuing violence of the partition is itself a direct continuation of the unprecedented and still unfolding violence of the modern apartheid colonial state. That violence of the apartheid colonial state was, of course, also spectacularly evident in Jallianwala Bagh. With that brief introduction, it is my privilege and great pleasure to introduce someone who needs no introduction at all when it comes to our topic, for she has written the seminal text on the subject, The Long Partition and the Making of Modern South Asia, Refugees, Boundaries, Histories. The Long Partition is among those rare books that show you with remarkable clarity the emergence and formation of a new historical world. Its author, Professor Vazira Fazila-Yacoobali Zamindar, is Associate Professor of History at Brown University. It is also my privilege and pleasure to introduce Dr. Ali Raza, who's an Associate Professor at Mushtaq Ahmed Gurmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences. His fabulous new book, just published, which will no doubt also prove path-breaking in its field, is called Revolutionary Past: Communist Internationalism in Colonial India. And with that, I would like to ask Professor Zamindar to address the topic briefly, and then we'll engage her. First she'll speak, and then Professor Raza will speak, and then I'll ask some questions, and then, of course, there can also be questions from the audience. All right, so Vazira.
Thank you for this invitation, Shamala, T2F. And as you noted, this is just yesterday was, I think, the anniversary of Sabine's death. And in fact, the book launch for the Long Partition took place at T2F when she was there, and was a very important host for that and so many other events. Where conversations could take place in the space that she created for that in Karachi, on legacy to be reckoned with, particularly in light of some other things I'm going to say, thinking about dissent and histories of dissent that we need to draw on. Sabine is a really important figure for that. And of course, the other anniversary that you spoke of, which is of Jallianwala Bagh, and that is close to my heart because that's a really important part of the new book that I'm working on, which is called The Ruin Archive. In this work, Jallianwala Bagh is an incredibly important pivotal event, something that we all know about in some sense, as we very cursorily run through some narrative of our history, of the histories that are told for the nation state. And I think for most people growing up in Pakistan, only the nation state of Pakistan and history and the nation state become inseparable. In any case, Jallianwala Bagh is something, at least at the very basic level, people know of as an incredibly important moment where violence, colonial violence, is enacted. But the framework in which that colonial violence is enacted and what ensues thereafter is one that is less well understood, or at least needs to be returned to, and we need to do some thinking and interpretive work with. For one, I think in a quick narrative of Jallianwala Bagh, one knows that this this massacre of people took place in Amritsar because of the participation of India in the First World War efforts. It had been forced into the war, and political parties had participated in the First World War effort, thinking that at the end of the war there would be a path to freedom. But what it did was instead the Punjab in particular, but all of India, had paid a huge, heavy price, not just in terms of people who got killed, who were deployed from this part of the world, but in terms of food, in terms of famines, in terms of shortages, real hardships. And when the Rollout Act, which the repressive measures, the hugely repressive measures of the war years, were retained as integral to the continuation, not an emergency measure, but of the war, but integral to colonial power, as it was going to be inscribed in the early 20th century. At the end of the war, this was a moment of dissent. There were protests that erupted all over all over India, but particularly in the Punjab. There were massive protests that were taking place. There were mobilizations. People were upset and angry. And this violence was carried out in retaliation for dissent, for the protests. And a pivotal moment in the scale of the violence was the fact that Europeans got killed in these protests. And this became a huge, huge factor in it. One of the aspects of the violence, the repressive, the massacre in Jallianwala Bagh itself is a huge, but one piece of it. And there were other forms of repression that preceded and ensued within days. For example, the first use of aerial bombing in South Asia massively redeployed the entire air force to the colonies, and the use of aerial bombing, a new kind of violence taking place in the colonies, sustained then through the Air Force sustained through colonial policing. The first instance of aerial bombing takes place in Gujranwala, which is in Pakistan, and wreaks a kind of fear and devastation. So one could say that there were at least three aspects to this violence. There was humiliation. If you look at the accounts of the violence, there was terror. And there was terror particularly enacted through technology and technological dominance. What Ranajit Guha, a very important historian of the region, has called dominance without hegemony. You can see it sort of inscribed in the violence with which the colonial state responds to what is dissent, anger, protests taking place against the form and nature of colonial rule. Now, we also know about Jallianwala Bagh. What it spurs is a massive organizing of a response to colonial violence. So you have this organic protest, and then an organized response to this nature of colonial violence. We know about the Hunter Commission report, but what is even more striking and an incredibly important resource, I would urge every one of our listeners to look at this resource, which is the Indian National Congress launches its own inquiry into the violence, detailed, massive, substantial interrogation on Indian terms of colonial violence, and they take apart systematically the racial order of this violence, the humiliation, terror, and technological dominance that is inscribed into it, including aerial violence. And I've read the documents within that on aerial violence. It is such a detailed critique of aerial violence that we would be hard pressed to find such a rigorous critique of, for example, drone violence today, an equivalent in. So you have this Indian National Congress which does this reporting, its own commission, its own report on the Punjab disturbances, as they come to be called, and hold the colonial violence to account. And what you have in its aftermath of Jallianwala Bagh is a massive anti-colonial response. And this inheritance of dissent, this is our inheritance of dissent, an anti-colonial response which is rigorous in its critique of colonial violence and the nature of colonial power, as well as hugely experimental in political imagination. What follows are revolutionary forms of responses, as we see, for example, in the figures of Bhagat Singh, and others, as well as non-violence, Gandhian non-violence that comes to be organized in its aftermath. You have massive numbers of people that come into political action, that gain political consciousness through the mobilization. So you have this combination of rigorous intellectual critique, anti-colonial critique, that is experimental in its political imagination, and is also mobilizes and organizes. What you have is a cultivation of a political consciousness in this process. So you have so many people, including Muslims from across this region, that become activated in, come into awareness, who come into thinking, and take on experiments of their own. And one of the figures I look at in my work most substantially is Abdul Ghaffar Khan or Bacha Khan. And if you think with his writing alone, we don't read Bacha Khan's writing in our curricula, in our everyday conversations. It's not as widely, although there is an Urdu and an English edition of it. I would again, that's another text I would say, read it, because it's there. It's our resource. It's our resource of dissent, of anti-colonial thought. And here, of course, we know that one of the things that Bacha Khan does, as is Khudai Khidmatgars, his movement, is decimate colonial knowledge formation that constructs the Pathans as violent or given to violence by creating one of the most stalwart, disciplined, non-violent political action in the region. But the other things that he does are less well known, which is actually interrogate history. One of the things that history comes to us as a colonial form of knowledge, as it divides Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists into entirely separate units of history. And he looks at this and he says this kind of division of history is absolute, along religious lines, is absolutely absurd. It makes no sense at all. It makes no sense at all because, as he says for the Pathans, he says this Gandhar and Buddhist past is our own, it's Pathan history. What is this kind of separation that we're doing between Buddhist and Hindu and Muslim? Because it's not separable. And he grapples with that question. The other body of thought that is really important to him. I mean, you think about Bacha Khan, you don't think of him as one who's thinking with religious difference, because you know, this region of India is almost 95% Muslim, and yet this question of religious communities that live together, and this living together of different religious communities as part of a singular shared ethos is something that's is incredibly important to him. It's not only the basis for his friendship with Gandhi, it's not only the reason why he takes all these Khudai Khidmatgars to the Congress and forms an alliance with it. Goes, you know, it's the first time that the Congress sees all these giant Pathans. It transforms the Congress's response to the colonial violence in the frontier as well. But besides that, I mean, for a region which is almost all Muslim, you could say, why should we in Pakistan be so incensed about religious, about the different religious communities and about a multi-religious ethos? Well, here is a man who's thinking, says this is integrally important because who we are depends upon it. Who we are as Muslims depends upon it. And it's it's central to his thinking. The third thing that is really, really vital in his work, in his thinking, is this idea of nation. This idea of nation or nation state as it comes to be crafted in Europe, particularly after the First World War. After the First World War, the nation state, which had only been one form of political community, now comes to be universalized across the globe. This is going to be the kind of political community we're going to now have in the world. At least it's expanded across Europe, and then after the Second World War will be. So it's like presented nation state as a form of political community that's crafted in Europe after the First World War. And these people are looking at it and they're saying, well, this doesn't make a lot of sense, this idea of the nation state. And they, as we know from the writing of many other thinkers, Gandhi in particular, we don't read Gandhi. We say in many of our textbooks that he's a Hindu leader, which is an absurd an absurd eviction of our own anti-colonial inheritance, because he's integral to our thinking as much as anyone else who is involved in this incredibly important time of political experimentation. What does it mean to be anti-colonial? What kinds of critique? What kinds of ethics are we going to need to form a way to live together? And living together is, as we know, important in Gandhi's work, but so is this question of the problematic of the nation state, and they want to experiment. So this political experimentation of this time is incredibly important because it's experimenting beyond and in conversation with this European nation state form that will eventually win its day, which is why you have both in Gandhi and in Bacha Khan an absolute refusal to accept partition. And in fact, this acceptance of partition as a political principle then results in then this evisceration of the loss of this anti-colonial inheritance that had been so robust. And this is precisely the anti-colonial inheritance that we need to return to, be in conversation with, think with, as we think with, for example, what it means to live in a partitioned South Asia, and to think of partition from this anti-colonial inheritance. So I'll stop there.
Wow, that was really thrilling. Thank you so much for that remarkable and also remarkably emotive at the same time. It was perfectly analytical and really so relevant at so many levels and so many registers. So yeah, thanks for that absolutely thrilling presentation. I'll save some of the questions that I have for later, but I'd like to ask Ali Raza to please also give us his thoughts on the matter.
Thank you. It certainly was thrilling, and I'm wondering what I can add to that. But by way of perhaps starting this conversation off, I just want to thank T2F. I want to thank Shumaila, and I want to honor the memory of Sabine. And Sabine obviously is linked to us in LUMS forever, perhaps because of what happened, because of an event that was cancelled at a university, and Sabine then took the charge of organizing that event. And so, in some ways, in many ways, in fact, we are forever, linked to her and indebted to her, and we honor her memory. So, thank you for organizing this. And I think the best thing that I can do is just to pick off and build up from where Vazira ended, which is partition. And what I find interesting, and that is also some of the general kind of, a general interest of mine, which is to think about the moment of decolonization and the moment of freedom, also as a moment of disillusionment and betrayal. Can freedom and the moment of decolonization and liberation also be a moment of betrayal? Is something that my work, is interested in exploring. And the reason why I say that is because there is obviously a lot of triumphalism associated with that idea and with that moment of, shall I call it the formal transfer of power? Let's not call it decolonization. Let's not call it emancipation. Let's not call it freedom. And I will return to why it's important to be cautious of these terms. Let's call it a formal transfer of power. Let's call it a partition for now. And what I found interesting when I started off with my work, which looks at communists and progressives of various shades across the subcontinent, what I found interesting was how that very moment that was considered to be a moment of celebration, of triumph, was considered by them at least, to be a moment of betrayal and of dashed dreams, and of perhaps, and obviously of devastation too. This was not the freedom that was envisaged by many political actors, not just the communists. I mean, Vazira mentioned Bacha Khan, Vazira mentioned Gandhi too. The partition that we inherited, the independence that was inherited by South Asia was a far cry indeed from the many imaginations and the visions and the dreams that were associated with the question of freedom and national liberation in South Asia. And communism was just one of the many strands of that truly diverse political spectrum that sought to imagine a different end game to empire. And I emphasize that because I think sometimes it's tempting to think of the political forms that were inherited at the formal transfer of power as perhaps the only inevitable political forms that could have been achieved. And what that misses out on are the many different dreams and the visions and those ideas that were associated with a truly different conception of freedom. If, to put it another way, and this is where Gandhi becomes interesting. If one were to simply inherit the European nation state, if one were to simply inherit the empire without any substantive change, then, as Gandhi said it, it's probably better to let the English run this place. There is no point in this freedom. कि अगर इन्हीं का निज़ाम चलाना है, इन्हीं का निज़ाम लेके चलना है, तो बेहतर है कि इन्हीं को चलाने दो. That to him was the logic, and in that sense, I mean, Gandhi is allied with radical thinkers across the colonized world, from Rabindranath Tagore to Frantz Fanon, all of whom think of a different notion of political community that is outside of this nation-statist model of sorts, which, as they rightly point out, led to devastation in Europe itself. I mean, if the First World War, if the Second World War was any reminder of anything, really, it was of the absolute bankruptcy and the disaster that was inherent in this idea of that differentiated political communities on the basis of race, on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of blood. And so, for all of these thinkers, one had to think of a different notion of political community. And the thinkers that I am interested in think of that political community in truly internationalist terms. They think of that political community as a political community that is comprised, that is constituted of the oppressed of the earth, the wretched of the earth, if I can quote, Frantz Fanon, which transcends those otherwise, seemingly natural divisions of ethnicity, of race, of religion, and so on. So in that sense, I mean, these conceptions of what it would mean to live in a world free of empire is something that I'm really drawn to when it comes to the progressive end of the political spectrum, which thinks of, as I said, a political community that transcends these otherwise seemingly natural and national, borders. So I mean, I think I'll end there. But to simply go on perhaps to thinking about what it would take to think of a truly decolonized future in the subcontinent, and to think of, in some ways, perhaps the disaffection of a present also as being linked to the unfulfilled promise of that freedom that Vazira spoke about. In some ways, this is a freedom that is still awaited. This is a freedom that is still anticipated, and this is the freedom that is yet to be attained.
Ali Raza, thank you for finishing so quickly, but I'd really like you to say something about what is such an important part of your book, about how partition foreclosed the possibility of internationalism. If you could say a bit about that.
Sure. I mean, it foreclosed one dream that was associated with independence, which was to attain a kind of freedom that, as I said, transcended these divisions, especially religious divisions. And so, when you look at the Communist Party, for example, of India, partition was a devastating blow to not just their politics, which obviously was split between India and Pakistan both, but also to their dream of thinking about a post-national, kind of political community, a post-religious, political community. that was constituted of workers and peasants and so on. So in that sense, partition dealt a death blow to that vision. But, and this is the interesting part, and this is what Vazira also showcases superbly in her book, when partition happens, I mean, it is so cognitively, it is so devastating that there's very little recognition that these boundaries are there to stay. And that is also the conclusion that the Communist Party of India derives. And the Communist Party of Pakistan, for instance, is only founded in 1948, because until then, they're still pretty much hopeful that this thing known as the Boundary Commission and the division of borders is basically temporary, and things will be back to normal. Pakistan and India are realities, yes, but surely one could not consider the prospect that these boundaries may be anywhere near permanent. To imagine that Lahore could be separated from Amritsar was inconceivable. And so it's only in 1948, late 1948, that a decision is taken to create the Communist Party. But interestingly enough, the Communist Party of West Pakistan, because in the East, there's still the hope that borders will be more porous, that there'll be more exchanges. And so in the East, the Communist Party for a long time remains the same. So the Communist Party of Bengal remains the Communist Party for both East and West Bengal. And so, this is one of the many kind of, dislocations and the cognitive kind of, devastation, I suppose, that partition unleashes. And so I think that the Communist Party at that time reflected the sentiment of many at the time, again, as Vazira's book shows, that none of this was imagined as being permanent, at least in the way that it is now. And so what that does is also link back to what Vazira's point was, which also goes again to the heart of Vazira's book, which is to think about partition not really as an event, but as an ongoing process with a logic that still plays out in India and Pakistan today, with the permanent minoritization of religious minorities in both countries. And so to that extent, certainly, partition was a death blow, as you put it, Nauman, to the vision of the communist, at least faction, except with one small proviso. That obviously doesn't stop people from dreaming, because in the 1960s and 1970s is another moment when progressives from both India and Pakistan and the world over, indeed, they're thinking seriously about the question of, for example, Afro-Asian solidarity, of the third world, of the global South. And the third world in their conception, that's really interesting. The third world in their conception, and I'm now drawing from Frantz Fanon, is not the third world of slums, of poverty that we think of when we think of the third world. This third world actually is a third way out of that false choice that is set up for the global South, which is to say that you should either follow the Anglo-American model, or you should follow the Soviet kind of model. And so this third world is really a third imagination, a third way. And that third way is not just held out as a promise for what is the global South, but rather as a promise for humanity at large. When Fanon speaks of the third world, he has in mind the remaking, as he puts it, of man itself, of the notion of the human itself. And I think those visions and those ideas, they are still interesting, and they still hold out that possibility in our present. I think I've spoken enough, but but I hope that gives some kind of a sense of why that was devastating, but also why one shouldn't stop dreaming. Perhaps, I mean, that project is still out there, to be thought of, to be reclaimed, to be reworked in our present.
Just to add to that, Ali, when you say the second moment in the 60s and 70s, actually, it's a continuation, because decolonization or the anti-colonial struggles, India might have gotten formal independence in 47, continues for much of the other colonized, the parts of the colonized world. And it's only in the 60s and 70s that you have, in many places, after armed struggle, and one which galvanizes, of course, like Algeria, people from all over the global south, including, people like from Latin America coming to the struggle. Rather than thinking of it as a second moment, it's really a long continuation across the 20th century of the anti-colonial struggle that is also incredibly, as you said, beautifully said, wanting it to be as much about a political imagination as anything else.
No, I could not agree more. And when you mentioned this, I was thinking of a few newspaper articles that I came across, in which students from Karachi University are holding a massive rally in protest against the assassination, protesting the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. This was a different moment in that sense. I mean, Patrice Lumumba was someone who was spoken about in the streets. Sahil Ludhianvi, "Khoon phir khoon hai, tapkega to jam jayega." I mean, that is a tribute to Patrice Lumumba, and so I think sometimes that's also another kind of inheritance that we have lost sight of, which is this inheritance of, as you said, the global struggle for decolonization and how that played out. Not just in universities and campuses, but also in print cultures. I'm sometimes struck by this deep kind of dissonance that one finds between texts that are published in the 60s and 70s and texts that are published today. I'm working on a project at this point which looks at precisely those questions, and then what I'm struck by is again that amazing range of print cultures that speaks of precisely those questions that you just highlighted. Speaking of issues from Latin America to the Vietnamese struggle against American imperialism and everything else in between, and I think that too is an inheritance that we may have lost sight of. And it's kind of funny because when we think of that liberal Pakistan, the extent of that imagination goes only to bars and clubs and so on. But this is something more. I mean, this is a true reworking in that sense, and a recasting of what is considered to be political community, and thinking beyond perhaps national boundaries of sorts.
Oh wow, excellent. If we have a wider audience, so if I may elaborate on some of the things that Vazira and Ali Raza have said. First, starting with the violence of the colonial state, because the violence of the state, of the nation state now, has become so normalized that people think that, well, this is just the way that states behave and have always behaved. There's no doubt violence that is associated with the state, time out of mind practically, but there is a qualitative difference between the violence of the modern state and the violence of the colonial state in particular. And I'd just like to briefly, the fact of the matter is that the period in which we live, which is now called the Great Acceleration, has very rapidly erased, because history is now proceeding and has been proceeding at such an extraordinary pace. And the kinds of transformations that our everyday life has undergone, really just over the past few decades even, has erased a great deal of the memory of the sorts of phenomena that Vazira and Ali Raza have talked about, for instance. But it's very, very important to remember that the colonial state, so two revolutions have taken place over the period of the past couple of centuries, or 2.5 centuries if we're talking about our region. First was the revolution of the apartheid colonial state. Former states, former empires in our region were not national empires, and they were not racial empires. So this is very, very important to understand. And everybody should be able to immediately recognize this, because the empires of the past were dynastic empires. They were not national empires, which is given away by their very names. So there were these racial empires, which also believed that their racial superiority corresponded to their historical superiority because of progress. So the contempt, and it's remarkable, if you look at that couple of 100 years that they ruled, 190 years to be precise. At the end of it, Churchill is saying, "I hate Indians; they are a beastly people," yeah, etc., etc. Yeah, so the racial hatred you will not find, yeah, in the empires of the past. You will not find anything like it, yeah, amongst the ruling classes. So it's very, very important to understand, and that's what the violence also corresponds to. Yeah, and the second revolution that took place in this time period that we are talking about, first is this revolution of the colonial apartheid state, and the second revolution is decolonization. Now, revolution in either of these two cases doesn't necessarily have positive connotations the way we've come to think of revolutions largely, yeah, especially on the left. Yeah, these are obviously revolutions. Decolonization, formal decolonization, as Ali Raza has pointed out. Formal decolonization is a revolution, and it's these catastrophic effects of it that both Vazira and Ali Raza has spoken about. Those catastrophic effects are revolutionary, yeah, both in terms of cognition and really very much in the form of life of people, yeah. So we must understand the magnitude, yeah, of transformation that happened over the past couple of centuries. With those remarks, I'd like to ask both of you, yeah, what about the extent to which, yeah, so even in these positive, to use a easy expression, these positive forces and positive personalities that you've spoken about, what one is also struck by today, yeah, is the extent to which colonial categories, yeah, the categories of the colonial state, because they are categories obviously not just cognitive categories, they are also categories of government, yeah, so Muslim, Hindu, etc. The extent to which they penetrated, yeah, the minds of even the best figures, yeah, that we can talk about, yeah. What do we do about that, and where are we with that? I mean, after all, what is happening right now in India is a direct product, yeah, of that colonial inheritance, that colonial legacy, and you'll find that even progressives, yeah, continue to hold on to colonial ideas about our history, yeah. Even the basic triptych of Indian history is retained by most people, actually, including amongst progressives. Yeah. What about that? Yeah. What are we to do with this continuing colonial inheritance?
Yeah, Ranajit Guha, who I'd mentioned earlier, has a line in one of his books which goes something like, there's one battle that the British never won, and that was a battle for the Indian past. And it's in his characteristic style of writing, beautiful flair, first line invocation to then go in and show the extent to which subaltern voices, subaltern figures of history, in fact, defeated, although now in looking at looking at the now, whenever I read this line, I am overwhelmed with this thought that the one battle that we seem to have lost is the battle for the Indian past. So rather than it being the battle that the British never won, it is in fact the battle that we seem to have decisively lost. It is heartbreaking because there has been so much thinking and writing before 47 and certainly thereafter to take on and interrogate the colonial formations of knowledge in particular, and yet made little or no dent on the ways in which most people understand, whether in India or in Pakistan, and I suspect also in Bangladesh and elsewhere, their histories. And part of that problematic might lie the persistence of the colonial framework. The persistence of the colonial framework might lie in the imperatives of nationalism or the nation states as they come to be formed in the aftermath of partition. Now, I mean, I recount this in my book, but it's something I've had to continuously grapple with, which is that having made the decision to agree to a principle which says that Muslims are a separate nation, whether the Indian National Congress abides by that ideological principle or not. By agreeing to partition, they, in some respect, agree to it as a framework. That the nation state as a form and the imperative of the nation state to produce histories, whether from an array of sources, not just the nationalists, not just the overtly nationalists, say the state textbooks, but also across historical imagination in a wide array of arenas in society. The imperative of the nation state might have been the holder of this colonial framework. I mean, the principle of partition and such was this colonial framework on the basis of we have constituted conception of who we are and where we belong. Deep investments that have come to be made on who we are and where we belong, reduced to circumscribed by this national framework. We see this, I mean, partitions, Nauman, you started out by giving us these statistics of when borders were to be formed. And certainly we see across the 20th century, you know, the incredible, I mean, almost all the nation states that we have are in fact predicated on a foundational violence, which we may call partition. Partition is a term we use specifically for us, but the Nakba in another, the Holocaust in another, the kinds of devastations and the inaugural devastations of the conquest of the New World, on the basis of which a racial nation state and settler colonial societies came to be formed as tied to this sort of this history, and in all and across the globe, you know, we're not singular in being hostage to the national imagination, as that being the basis of us thinking who we are and where we belong. It's a global phenomena, and it is in these instances anti-colonial thought, and maybe Ali can the internationalist imagination, where it's coming from is like, this is suffocating, you know, these categories of colonial rule, of colonial government, of colonial violence are suffocating. You live them, and they are encampments, and this sensibility is visceral in anti-colonial movements, and this desire to break free of it. So maybe Ali, you can speak more to these movements of internationalism, which arguably come from this desire to have a different kind of political ethos for how we live in the world.
I mean, thank you for that, Vazira. I think that's one of the questions that I suppose one struggles with most as a historian, which is to think about how one is perhaps always responding out of necessity to the colonial archive in some ways, one is always writing against it. I think that, to begin from what Nauman said, in terms of thinking of our task, I think part of our task as historians is precisely to keep writing against the colonial archive, and not least because, as you mentioned, these nationalisms that we have inherited are directly linked to colonial logics. They are, in fact, colonial logics. There is little to separate national logics from colonial logics. They're one and the same. And I'm always struck, and I'm deeply struck always by just how frequently one finds echoes of James Mill's History of India in our textbooks. It's almost as if, it's a ripoff. With this division of Indian history into Hindu kind of, the period and the Muslim period and then the British period is something that is Orientalist of fiction. That's something that's echoed in both actually textbooks in India and Pakistan, and presumably Bangladesh too. So, and again, some of the stereotypes that of the martial race, of the manly kind of these figures who with martial prowess and so on. These two are colonial stereotypes that are echoed faithfully, and so it has become such a part of. It's become so widespread and such a huge part of public, in some ways, common sense. If one can put it very simply. That this represents, what you said. I think that which is that one true conquest of the colonial regime, which was an epistemic conquest, which was a conquest of knowledge and a conquest of a logic, which not just conquered, as you said, the past of India, but it also at the same time. Basically devalued those other systems of knowledge, those other systems of knowing and inhabiting the world, of being in the world. And one of the things that colonialism does the world over is to cast the knowledges of the world into this hierarchy of sorts, as we all know. And those other ways and imaginations of inhabiting and being in the world are devalued under the guise of some kind of rationality or objective kind of like vantage point, or of course this bizarre claim of scientism and the idea that there can be a scientific principle to understanding the course of human history and so on. And again, those assumptions they have become commonplace, and I think that. As scholars, one would have to have a larger conversation around, what kind of tasks lay before us. But I think as scholars, to us in the subcontinent, I think it is unavoidable for us to continue to speak against these colonial/national logics. I don't know what else to say beyond that. I covered pretty much everything else.
Yes. If I may add to that, actually, it's not as bleak as this would. One way in which it is not that bleak is that, in fact, a lot of the proliferation and dissemination, and you're absolutely right. So not only can you get Mein Kampf in practically any vernacular language, you can also find, for instance, Ibbetson's Tribes and Castes of the Punjab in Urdu. I was at the airport and at the reading stall. I saw this massive book sitting there in Urdu, and I went to look it up, and it was a translation of Ibbetson's Tribes and Castes of the Punjab. Yeah, so people actually still read stuff produced by British administrators as their own history. Yeah, British colonial scholars / administrators, or administrators / scholars, scholars. Yeah, as being authentic history. But I'd also like to, in terms of working out the apartheid logic. So, I'm sure, like you guys as well, I'm very inspired by the work of Mahmood Mamdani. And recently I've been reading another fabulous scholar about the nation state. In her case, she's working on Europe, but it's a Canada, but it's a wider argument, Nandita Sharma. who's written this book called Home Rule, which is about the apartheid constitution of citizenship in Canada. But thinking about our region, it seems to me that the way that racialization, this is one thing that we don't talk about, the extent to which, so in the case of the Africans, it's impossible for them not to immediately thematize the question of race. But we don't talk about that question of race, both with respect to the fact that we are, obsessed with the Gora, right? Being Gora in every possible way. Yeah, it's really structures our lives, in fact, and that's what the orientation of our, of everything is, right? As far as the state is concerned. Yeah. The racialization is precisely the racialization of religion. So Hindus are a race and Muslims are a race. Yeah. So the Goras are a race and they are a separate race from us. But we are also, of course, divided into races. The main two races, of course, there are others. Yeah. But the main two races being Hindus and Muslims, which are actually completely racialized. So you'll find educated people in Pakistan, for instance. I've heard, Pakistanis are fairer than Indians. Why? Why is that? Well, because, Muslims supposedly came from the outside and they're a separate race. Yeah, this is a totally racialized argument. Yeah, I mean, a completely racial. So you're talking about taking out the average tint of over 200 million people in one case and over 1 billion people in the other case. It's obviously completely a priori. Yeah? It has nothing to do with any reality. It's just a function or a function of these precisely these racialized categories. Hindus are a race and the indigenous race, therefore they are darker. And Muslims are a race and they are from the outside, therefore they are fairer. The extent to which the racialization we have repressed in South Asia, I think, is an important function of our inability to actually think about colonialism. I mean, it's not just us, obviously. I think the world over, actually, because the nation state system and progress, development, etc., these things are so closely intertwined with each other. Yeah, racialization exists all over the planet. It's like a global apartheid, and the nation state itself reproduces racialized orders everywhere. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Along these lines, I saw that there was a question by Shayma Kirmani that appeared on the screen, and she asked the question: is Pakistan a nation? I know there and one of the reasons I wanted to respond to that was because I know that comes up like for many people it seems more artificially produced and therefore one which the question what is national culture, who are we as a nation, continuously gets asked in Pakistan in a way more so than apparently elsewhere. But I would like to just say to that every single nation is produced in the same artificial manner as Pakistan has been. It's just that because it has a name that and a territorial formation that doesn't inscribe as readily onto prior existing names and places. Does not mean that it is any more or less new than other nation states, all of which have been produced in the 20th century. I think placing the Pakistan becomes therefore an interesting place to think from. Pakistan as such as one that necessarily requires us to grapple with its foundational violence, partition, is one that's actually some reason why we should be, having grown up in this kind of a political community, more critical and able to generate thought that helps us think with the history of the modern world more broadly, history of colonialism and anti-colonial struggles more as this where we are, the site from which we must ask those questions, but that these questions are not unique to not to deny there are some historical specificities in every single place, but it is an incredibly vital place for historical inquiry because it helps us think with the rest of the world in maybe more clear ways than say in other places when nationalism is much more how would you say it, much more part of the habitus of a place, less self-conscious, born than we do. We're more self-conscious about the garb of nationalism than say others, and that's a good thing, and that's one that should help us think with others.
That also corresponds to the other positive thing that I was going to say, but then I started making another point, which is that the problems that we are talking about, the cognitive problems that we are talking about, cognitive pathologies that we are talking about, are largely limited to the literate classes. It's actually the literate classes that have a lot of these ideas and this, the lived reality that you were talking about, Vazira, and those other pasts, because the past doesn't just disappear. Of course, it might change forms, but like Faulkner said, the past is never dead. It isn't even past. So all of those potentialities, it's the idea of progress that makes us think that we leave behind, but it's materially impossible for the past to disappear because, of course, things are material, therefore they are continuous. So there are these potentialities, even though in the worldview of the literate classes, those don't appear. But the subaltern classes, it's still, of course, there's a lot of invasion, but at the same time, there are other potentialities that continue to exist. Yes, Ali Raza, you were saying?
No, indeed, there are other potentialities that continue to exist, and I too was struck by that question that Vazira spoke about, which is Pakistan a nation? Perhaps it's one of the most oft asked questions that we find across the last few decades and so on. So, and I keep coming up with different answers to that. I suppose in some ways, yes, Pakistan is a nation because there's a clear sense of who doesn't belong, which is key to any national project. There's a key sense of who the minorities are and what their place is within this national project. And what happens to those minorities on a daily basis is something that we're all aware of. But I do get where this question comes from, which is to say which is to think of the nation in a different way. But in that sense, no, I suppose Pakistan is not really a nation, at least in the spirit in which the question is asked. But my response to that usually is that I hope it never becomes a nation, because I think there are much better political communities to envisage and to envision and to come up with. I certainly hope that one can do better than think of one as being part of a national project. I hope we can think of other projects.
Excellent. We are also out. Yeah, we can go on for a long time, and but I think we are out of time, and that's I think an excellent way of ending. Of ending this session. So thank you both very, very much for just a really, really thrilling conversation and presentations. And thank you to T2F and Shumaila for asking us to do this. Khuda Hafiz, everyone.
Khuda Hafiz, thank you so much.
Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz.